Good afternoon, everyone. And for those of you out there who are joining us for the first time, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Clovis Community College. This year marks the 150th anniversary of the birth of Mahatma Gandhi, one of the most impactful leaders in history and whose legacy continues to be honored throughout the world. In fact, because of the work by our very own Dr. Kapoor, we have an annual celebration each year at Fresno State. So today we have the honor of hosting Gandhi's granddaughter, Miss Ela Gandhi. She was born and raised in Durban, South Africa, and is a peace activist and a social worker by profession. As a social worker, she practiced in the field of child welfare for more than 10 years and also served as the chancellor of Durban University for several years. She is involved in numerous Gandhian social work projects, including a domestic violence program in South Africa, and is the honorary president of the World Council of Religions for Peace. Ms. Gandhi is a former member of the Parliament of South Africa, where she served from 1994 to 2004. And during the apartheid era, she was banned from political activism in 1975 and was subjected to house arrest for 9 years. She is the recipient of several national and international awards for all of her work and service. Please help me welcome to our home the Honorable Ela Gandhi.
Well, as I understand it, this is a tradition to put the flowers on our honored guest, and so it's my privilege to honor you for being in our presence.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So, good afternoon. And just to fight time, I will say what we do in South Africa, all protocols observed. So I recognize everybody who is sitting here and honor everyone who is sitting here. Thank you for inviting me to this campus. And so today my topic was nonviolence and its significance for the 21st century, and particularly Gandhian legacy. I just want to start off by saying that it's also the 150th birth anniversary of Kasturba Gandhi, who is less known. She was the wife of Mahatma Gandhi. And she was also a very brave woman. And just to say why I say she was a brave woman and made her contribution in South Africa, because she defied the laws, she was imprisoned for 3 months. And today we have a little exhibition in the prison cell where she was detained. That's in South Africa. In India, besides all the work that she did, and it can take a whole day to explain that, but in 1942, the Congress, the Indian National Congress, decided to say we've had enough now and tell the British to quit India. They took a resolution that they are going to ask the British to quit India, the Quit India resolution. So the resolution was taken on the 8th of August, and on the 9th of August, there were a whole lot of mass meetings that were arranged. But by the evening of the 8th of August, all the leaders of the Indian National Congress were arrested and put into prison. And so there were very few people left to make the speeches at these mass meetings. And some of them were saying, let's cancel the meeting. But my grandmother said that she will go to the meeting and she will address the meeting in place of Mahatma Gandhi. When she went to the meeting, she was arrested. And that was on the 9th of August, 1942. And she passed away in February of 1944. And she passed away in prison. Now, if that's not a legacy that we should celebrate, then what is? So this was a woman. So having said that, what we face, the world faces today, is that the levels of violence and corruption all around the country, all around the world, are rising, and they are alarming the people. Violence, hatred, corruption, and anger are daily revealed in horrific ways. I know in my country there are some horrific incidents of violence, and I know that in your country as well, and in many other countries around the world. So within the situation, how does Gandhian teachings help us? This is what we need to grapple with. Now, in looking at this, I'm going to look at just one or two aspects. Firstly, Gandhiji came to South Africa to represent a person in a lawsuit. The legal position was that there were two cousins, and the one cousin was suing the other cousin for an amount of money. And because the both parties couldn't understand English very well, they asked Mahatma Gandhi to come to South Africa and read up what the law said, and translate it into Gujarati, which is the language that they spoke, to the person, the one party. And Gandhiji looked at the law, looked at exactly what was happening here, and then he asked his client whether he could go and speak to the other cousin, to the cousin. And this person who had brought him there, his name was Dada Abdullah, he laughed and he said, what a stubborn man that is. What do you want to go and speak to him for? And Gandhiji said, but give me a chance, let me speak to him. And so Dada Abdullah said, okay. And Gandhiji then went and spoke to the man. And the outcome of that was that he was able to mediate a settlement. He had explained to both the parties what mediation means, and they agreed, and they came together, and he mediated between the two, and everything was settled. What Gandhiji said is that from this, what he learned is, firstly, if they had gone to court, and if they had allowed the court case to continue, both of them would have spent so much of money that in the end it would have far exceeded the amount that this person was claiming. Number two, that they would be enemies because of the court case. At the end of it, they would never talk to each other. And number three, the person who was claiming the money would probably not get anything because the man who was supposed to give him the money would have paid most of the money that he had to the courts. And he would have nothing to pay to this client of Gandhiji's. So through the mediation, firstly, both the brothers became friends. They both were able to benefit because they didn't have to spend so much on the court case itself. And although the other man wasn't able to pay the full amount, in one lump sum. An arrangement was made, an amicable arrangement for him to pay it slowly in installments. So both parties were happy. Both parties became friends. And what Gandhiji said is that this taught him a lesson. It taught him that mediation was always a better form of law than to take clients to court and work on a long drawn-out case. And so for the rest of his time in South Africa as a lawyer, he continued to mediate many cases where he could. He mediated between the two parties. Now, when we talk about nonviolence and we talk about Satyagraha, this is the nucleus of Satyagraha. It's the nucleus of what it means to mediate in conflict situations, rather than to resort to violence, to resort to all kinds of violence. And violence is not just physical violence. It can be verbal violence. It could be all kinds of violence. There are many forms. And so he decided that this was a much better way of dealing with these issues. Then in 1906, this happened in 1894, that he mediated this case, concluded the case, and then was ready to return to India. But in 1894, he also came across another issue, and this was about the vote. In those days, African people, Indian people, and colored people had a qualified franchise. A qualified franchise would mean that you have to have a certain amount of money, some property, you have to be well-dressed, you have to have certain education, qualifications, and so on. If you meet those criteria, then you are considered to be capable of exercising a vote. If you don't meet those criteria, you can't exercise a vote. So it was a qualified franchise. Whilst the white people had a complete, everybody could vote. Everybody of a certain age. So there was only an age limit, not qualification limit. But what the people felt is, even though it was a qualified vote, they were able to exercise some sort of power in the government. And therefore, at that time, all three race groups accepted that this was an important center of power that they wanted. But there was a rule, a law that was being passed at the time, asking for this qualified franchise to be removed, so that all three race groups would no longer have even the qualified franchise. And that's when Gandhiji began to petition and stayed on in South Africa to oppose this particular law. But at the same time, as I said earlier, it was three communities that were affected. And he made a statement there that even though he was fighting, or he was taking up the issue of the Indian community, he said that even the African community should have that vote, qualified or not, but that they should be allowed to vote, and that that vote shouldn't be taken away from any one of the three communities. So that was in 1894 that he said this to the he made this remark in a document in one of the newspapers. And I do have the actual reference, if anybody would like to see it afterwards. I'm not going to give it right now. So that was a statement that he made. Then he decided in 1904, about, from 1894 to 1904, they were about 10 years later, he decided that he should change his lifestyle. And this revelation or need to change came about because of 3 or 4 different incidents in his life. The first one was his visit to Marion Hill, a monastery established by Trappist nuns and Trappist monks in Durban, just in the vicinity of Durban. And he was asked by some friends to go and visit them because he could learn a lot from that monastery. So he visited, and he was absolutely amazed. And he wrote an article in The Vegetarian, which is very interesting, where he talked about how impressed he was with the monastery itself, the discipline that was exerted in the monastery, the equality that existed between the monks, the nuns, and the people who were living there. Everyone was, did all the work together. They were all on the same plane. There was equality in this monastery, and he was amazed with that. And he was amazed at the amount of work that they did with their hands. They did a lot of agricultural work. They did a lot of other handwork like sewing, leather work, carpentry, and so on. All the students who were in this monastery engaged in those kinds of activities. And this also, was something that inspired him. Later on, he sent many people from his group to go to the monastery and learn leather work and other skills from them. So in 1904, he decided that now is the time when he should start an ashram. And that ashram was started at Phoenix Settlement, which was about 17 kilometers out of Durban. Durban was the city, and this was out of Durban. It was a rural area with no services whatsoever. They had to have, established their own sort of services. And a person who was living in that monastery, or a person who wrote about the ashrams, by the name of Mark Thompson, and he writes about Gandhi and his ashrams. And this is what he said, and I want to quote this. In these small monastic communities of men and women living according to absolute vows, he, that's Gandhiji, sought to lay the groundwork for an egalitarian social organization and economy, and to develop an education system that reflected the Indian genius. He believed ashramic life based on mutuality, simplicity, and hard work would nurture an asceticism that could be channeled through positive action to reform society. So this is where the whole idea of reforming society came into his mind, and some of the ways in which he wanted to reform society were to create an egalitarian social order and to create an education system that reflected this egalitarian idea, so that everybody begins to think that, this is how we should all live. And if we all change our mind and live according to these ideals, these kinds of vows, which he called vows, then maybe the whole social order would change. And so that was the whole idea. By then, he had also begun to think in terms of gender equality. He had begun to think of, of giving opportunities and recognizing the power and the equality of women. And so in this ashram, men and women were treated on an equal plane. They shared all tasks, and they worked together shoulder to shoulder, and they, behaved in a way where there was no hierarchical position. Everybody was on the same level. So he did away with the hierarchy in the ashram. And this then led to, in 1913, women began to join the Defiance campaign. And for the first time, women went and defied the laws and were imprisoned. So that is where Kasturba participated, and she was also imprisoned in South Africa. Prior to that, in just a few months before that, African women who were also, deprived of their freedom by having to have a pass on them, which meant that we all have ID documents or a birth certificate. But this law imposed an additional burden that you have to carry it with you. So on the road, if a policeman stops you and you don't have an ID document, they can arrest you and put you in prison immediately. So this was what they objected to. And a whole lot of women who, for the first time, this law was extended to women, they decided to march. They took all their ID documents and marched to the nearest public office, police station or a council office, post office, and so on. Any public office that was nearest to them. And they marched and they handed in their ID documents and told them, we're not going to carry these anymore. And that was organized by Charlotte Mteke, who was also influenced by American board mission, where she came to America and studied here, and then went back to South Africa and organized the women in that country. So there's a close connection between America, India, and South Africa because of these connections. Dr. Dubé, who was a neighbor of Gandhiji, he was also influenced by Tuskegee and Booker T. Washington, and he started a school there where they taught a lot of handwork and so on. And so Gandhiji also emphasized the idea of handwork. So again, there's that link between U.S., Booker T. Washington, Dr. Dubé, and Gandhi. And so we have those three links. And it was taken further when Martin Luther King started the civil rights movement here. And he was also influenced by Gandhiji. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela has also talked about reading about Gandhiji whilst he was in Robben Island and deciding that we should have a negotiated settlement. So those were people who were influenced and inspired by Gandhian ideas. Today, we need to think of how are we going to be inspired by his ideas? How do we change our society? And I know, talking to a lot of people, a lot of communities, young people, what I've been told is that unless you practice violence, unless you burn up something, break down something, the media doesn't pay any attention to you. You go on a peaceful march and nobody pays attention to you. So now, that is the reason that is given by many people for having violent confrontations. The other reason is that why should we just remain violent and docile when the police and the authorities exert so much of violence on us? Now that's where we need to learn the Gandhian philosophy of nonviolence. His philosophy of nonviolence was that firstly, it is a strength that you acquire from within yourself. To acquire that strength, you need to look within yourself and build up that courage, because it requires more courage than to fight with a gun, than to go to war. You have to be courageous to go to war, to pick up a gun. But you have to be even more courageous to be involved in a nonviolent struggle. This is what Gandhiji said, and that is what Martin Luther King said. And therefore, to build up that courage and to learn the methodology of nonviolent struggle, you have to train. You can't just go and practice nonviolence without undergoing the training. So the training is very important because it is a discipline, and particularly for the leadership of the organization. Now, we also practice nonviolent, ways of opposing apartheid. We had the mass democratic struggle. We had confrontations with the police. And I'll tell you of one little story. There was an area, little settlement. They used to have people in ghettos. So there was this township in which mainly Indian people lived, because there was group areas. So each community lived in different townships. So this particular township had Indian people in that township. And these people lived in council houses, little houses that were built by the city council, and they gave the houses to the people, but on rent. So people had to pay rent. People had to pay for water and pay rent in those houses. And what happened is that after they brought them from an area where they were living in informal housing. So this area had a piece of land where they chopped up pieces of land and told the people to live there, build their own houses, and survive. We're just giving you a piece of land. That's what the government said, because they were homeless. And then the people lived there. They built their own houses, wood and iron houses. And they had a piece of land where they kept their animals. They had their little gardens. And they were able to survive on the garden. And they had hens. And they could, get eggs and so on. And so they had some livelihood there. They didn't have to pay rent. They had no electricity. So they used, candles and paraffin lamps and gas and so on, for which they had to pay, but not as much as they had to pay in the council house. So the first shock for them was to move from this place, go into this house, which was now a double-story house, which was just one room and a kitchen. So the whole family had to live in that. Whereas in this piece of land, if there were 5 people, they had rooms for each person. Each, individual had their own privacy, and so on. So each family would build according to their own needs. Whereas now, they had to live in this house, which was just one room. Whatever your need is, that's irrelevant. You live there. And so that was the first, issue that the community faced. The second issue was soon after they brought them into the township, about a year after they came in, the rent was increased. And that the people just couldn't face. It was difficult for them. Life was difficult for them in the first instance, and now it would be even more difficult. So the people organized, and we helped them to organize. And it's largely the women who are in the house during the day. And so these women marched to the rent office and said, "We want to see the city manager, and we are going to sit here until the city manager comes." And they all sat in the rent office. The police came and pointed guns at them. They said, "We are sitting here. We don't care what you do. We want the manager to be here, and until he comes, we're not moving." And so they were able to brave those guns, stand in front of those guns without moving, with dignity and respect. They didn't swear at them, they didn't throw stones, they didn't do anything like that. They just sat. And eventually these people had to give in. The city council had to give in. And that was a victory that we won, the first victory that the people won because of their courage and because of what they did. So in the same way, these demonstrations were replicated in many different areas in the country. Those who faced similar problems would then demonstrate and, take action against the council and what the council was doing. Now, my point is that it is far more courageous to stand there. Imagine these women sitting there and all these guns being pointed at them. So, it does take a lot of courage. I can tell you because I too sat there. And the second point is that everyone has to be agreeable to the demonstration. So it wasn't like anyone was forced to come there. We had to do a lot of work, door-to-door work, make people understand. And they then agreed that this is how we are going to demonstrate. So we didn't go there and say to the people, "Look, you need to go and sit here in the rent office." It was their decision. It wasn't our decision. It was them coming together as a community, not somebody else imposing their decision on the community. So these were important lessons, because once somebody goes, a social worker goes there and says to the people, "This is what you must do," then it doesn't work. All those people who are social workers here will tell you it doesn't work. But when the people say, "This is what we want to do," and the decision and the idea is from them, it will succeed and they will do it. So that is the second lesson that Satyagrahis need to know. They can support, they can be with the people, but the decision is the people's decision, not somebody else's decision. Finally, I just want to say that, there are lots of benefits. Just as when Gandhiji mediated, there were lots of benefits in a nonviolent struggle. So there are lots of benefits in this kind of nonviolent struggle, because at the end of the day, those workers who were sitting there in the rent office also sympathized with the people. The policemen who came with their guns couldn't use their guns because they also felt sorry for these people who were sitting there. If the people picked up a stone and hurled it at them, they wouldn't be sympathizing. They would be angry, and they may shoot. But because they sat there in a non-violent way, they gained the sympathy and the respect of the opponent, because those were opponents. Those were people working for the council, policemen who were supposed to control the crowd. And so nonviolence shows us that we can make friends. If you look at the Serbian revolution, you'll see how they made friends. They went out of their way to make friends with the police and with other people. And it was largely led by young people. So the young people have a lot of power, and the world is now looking at what the young people can do. And we all depend on the energy of the young people. We are almost at the end of the road, but you have the next generation to look at. You are there to protect not yourselves only, but the next generations. And therefore, there is a great responsibility on the young people. And I think that if you were to read Gandhiji and Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez and many other leaders who, used nonviolent means of struggle, you will then begin to see the advantage in using nonviolent means. So the legacy of Gandhiji, the most important legacy, is the whole idea of nonviolent revolution. And if we can engage in nonviolent revolution, we will be doing a great service to ourselves, to the community, to the next generation. And just finally, I want to say one thing, that today we have more nuclear weapons than we had in 1940. Today there are about 67 countries in the world who have atom bombs. And if you look up what happened to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki victims, and you look at what is still continuing to happen to the next generation of the people who were exposed to those, gases at that time, you will realize how fatal, how terrible those emissions are from nuclear weapons. So in those times, if one country loses its mind and uses a weapon, we all can suffer from it. You know what environmental issues we are suffering. And therefore, it is important for us to all rise up and say no more nuclear weapons. Use that money to the advantage of the poor. Give that money so that the poorest of the poor can benefit. And if they have a better life, if they have access to education, healthcare, housing, food, and so on, there would be no need for wars. There would be no need for tensions in the world. And therefore, it's our responsibility to make sure that these nuclear weapons are dismantled. In South Africa, they did dismantle the nuclear weapon that South Africa had. I know in Kazakhstan, they dismantled the weapon. Other countries can also take that example, and we need to rise up and say with one voice that this is what we want. That is the legacy that Gandhiji, that Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, and all the other peace activists have left for us. Use peace, not war. Thank you very much.
Questions? Okay. Truly an honor, especially to just be in the presence of someone such as Miss Ela Gandhi. And for all of you to experience this, I hope you guys never forget this moment in your life. As you read your history books, as your children and their children read, you'll know that we had the opportunity to hear a message that has been shared from generation to generation, and it will still continue to do that. So we can't thank you enough for being here and taking the time. And Dr. Kapoor, thank you for thinking of Clovis Community College and allowing Ms. Gandhi to come here. So we have an opportunity for just a couple of questions. And right after that, I'm going to take Ms. Gandhi over to our overflow section so the students there get a chance to at least be able to see her. And then we'll come back into the foyer, into the lobby area, and there's a reception that'll take place there and an opportunity for some photos. So a couple of questions does anyone have a question you've been thinking? Oh, yes, you do. Quick. Could you stand up real quick and repeat that question a little bit louder, hon? I thought we had a microphone.
You said about people who've been firing police on sexual orientation and gender identification. Do you think that people of those sexual orientation and gender identification could use Gandhi's way to create a protest?
Could Gandhi's way deal with sexual orientation, gender orientation, those people who've been dealing with that? Is Gandhi the way to...
Sexual orientation.
Oh, yes, those people who've been abducted because of sexual orientation. Can Gandhiji's views be used his way?
So you're talking about the LGBTI? Yes? Okay. I think that, in Gandhiji's time, there wasn't a focus on LGBTI. But from my understanding, if we talk about equality, we talk about equality for everyone. And one of the things Gandhiji said is that we, as human beings, make compartments, and we compartmentalize everyone. We consider a person in terms of what we are conditioned to think. So when I look at you, I think, well, you look like a white person, you look like so-and-so, maybe a hippie, a young person. Okay, and then you say that this is a bad label. How dare you call me a hippie, And then you begin to start all the tensions because you have compartmentalized this person and you've labeled. You've given that person a label. Now, labeling, judging people, Gandhiji said that judging people is a bad thing. And there was a little story. I like to tell little stories, if you don't mind. Okay. Gandhiji, on one of his tours, ships, he was on a voyage from some place to another on a ship. And there were a whole lot of young people on that ship, and they decided that just for, recreation, they are going to bring out a little letter, newsletter, and they called it Scandal Times. Scandal Times. So you can imagine the kind of stories that they found. And they thought it was amusing to go and write stories about different people, scandals about different people, and put it into that newsletter. They wrote it out and they brought it to Gandhi and they said, so what do you think of this? And it was a whole lot of papers like this, pinned together with an office pin. And so Gandhi read through that, and then when they came back and asked, so what do you think? Gandhi took out the office pin and gave them back the papers. And they said, so what do you think? And he said, well, I've taken the most precious thing from these papers. So that was his view about, judging people, about criticizing people, and so on. He felt that you can't compartmentalize people and judge them. Everyone is equal, everyone has value. And there's no ageism, sexism, anything like that, racism, all that he would have. So although he didn't specifically talk about LGBTI, in my view, he wouldn't discriminate, definitely, and he wouldn't label. Hope that answers, yeah.
Do you want to come up so we can everybody for your
Hello. From an economic perspective, how do you think that we could apply Gandhi's teachings in our everyday lives as consumers and as young students? We've sometimes feel a responsibility to make sure that when we spend $2, which is what half of the population of the world lives on a day, we spend it responsibly and with knowledge that other people live off of that.
Okay, so do you want more questions?
No, that's
Okay. So Gandhiji said, that there is a need for a certain amount of comfort and certain amount of resources that every person needs to live a good life. But beyond that, if you take from the community, then he said that it was theft. So actually, translated in simple language, it means that take what you need, distinguish between needs and wants, and take whatever you are, absolutely needing for your livelihood. But beyond that, you should not consume. You shouldn't hoard things. You shouldn't accumulate stuff, because it is bad for the environment. And it is, when you are taking that, you are depriving somebody else of having what you have. So if we were prepared to share, if we are prepared to live in a way that is, according to Gandhiji, just a good lifestyle, but not beyond that, not in absolute affluence and so on, then you won't have the super rich on that side and those who have nothing on this side. You will have everyone who has some, everyone who has some, access to resources that are needed for living. Okay.
Thank you. Good question. So we'll have one last question. You know what? Let me give you I think that
Yeah.
you have the question of the day.
Yeah.
What's your name? How old are you?
I'm 10 years old.
10 years old? Excellent. Go for it.
How do you think that we could apply Gandhi's teachings in our everyday lives when a lot of people are afraid of the consequences?
You're officially enrolled, by the way, too.
Okay, I think, Gandhiji would have told everyone that, there are certain values that are very important, like respecting all people, ensuring that you don't hurt the dignity of any individual, of living in a way that you are close to nature, that you are a part of nature and not apart from nature. So those are some of the things that Gandhiji talked about. And if we can all do that, if we learn to respect each other, you wouldn't react to somebody in anger. So you need to also remember that you have to respect the person, so you won't get angry and start swearing, using bad language, hurting the dignity of the other person. So it is partly self-control, and because we all do get angry, but we have to learn to control that anger. And you learn to respect other people. I think that if we do those two things, we will learn to live a much better life.